Hello, my name is Jenny Simpson and I work for Nottingham Trent University, and today I'm going to be taking you through supervision of social work students. So we're really grateful that you are a work-based supervisor, and today we're going to be focusing on a number of things in terms of the aims of this session. So we'll begin with considering how adult learners learn. We'll move to what is supervision. We'll then go on to benefits of supervision for a social work student, ways of providing supervision, elements of supervision, the supervision agreement, and finally recording of supervision meetings. So you may be wondering, why do we need to look at how adults learn? Well, one of the things that we need to remember is that the student placed with you, first and foremost, is an adult, and that for them, in terms of the placement that is being provided to them, it's a learning environment. It's where the student is learning the knowledge, skills, and behaviours related and necessary for social work. So consequently, as a work-based supervisor, there's a need for you to appreciate that the environment that the student is coming to is not just a workplace, but it's also their learning environment. So let's move on to how do adults learn. Whereas you can see there, Knowles talks about the fact that adults learn very differently from children. And there are key characteristics to that, as you can see, beginning with adults need to know why they're learning something. They need to be independent and responsible for their own actions. We need to remember that adults have a wealth of experience, that actually adults value learning, and very importantly, any learning is internally motivated. And so it's really important that we grasp that when students are coming to us, they will be bringing a whole range of experience with them. And the approach is set out by Knowles is hugely beneficial, because what it does do is it speaks to the fact that the learning environment should be supportive and it should enable the student's self-concept and self-esteem. Importantly, your student should have a say in the content and the process of their learning. So things like setting up their learning objectives, for example, on how to complete an assessment or how to undertake a period on the duty desk, or how to actually undertake a direct intervention with a service user. The learning that the student undertakes ought to also be collaborative in its approach. So there's some kind of learning agreement, there's a shared evaluation of the learning going on. And importantly, as part of setting up that learning environment, you as the work-based supervisor need to ensure that the student's respected, that they're valued, and that their past experience is acknowledged, not just by you, but also by other members of your team. Other things to take into account is that the learning that is being undertaken by the student does need to focus on problem solving. So it's not just about memorizing facts or memorizing procedures and processes, but also it's about working through how to resolve problems that arise in practice. The learning should be active, and all learning should include effective and supportive feedback. And that shouldn't just come from the practice educator, but that also must come from you as a work-based supervisor and any other professionals that that student is in contact with. So very much in terms of the experience of a student, it's not a matter of the learning environment being such that the student is told what to do. Rather, it's about the student discovering and applying what they've learned in university and then bringing that to the placement environment. And your role, amongst others, is to support the student to do that. So let's move on to looking at what is supervision. supervision. So, as you can see from the bullet points on the slide, supervision is absolutely central to social work. Okay, in terms of the student placement, they should have weekly supervision, and that's normally provided by the practice educator. They will be providing that student with 1.5 hours of weekly supervision. And importantly, supervision is a structured two-way process, and that's in order to achieve and maintain professional standards. But let's return to this idea of weekly supervision. So the practice educator may be and is supervising in terms of the students' learning around theory to practice, around their knowledge, around the application of the PCFs. But as a work-based supervisor, your role will be supervising the students' casework and ensuring that they are carrying out their work according to your organization's policies and procedures. You may also be in contact with the practice educator because they may ask you to revisit things as part of the casework supervision that goes on for the student. So it's really important that there's a very clear role and responsibility and boundaries around the supervision that is provided to the student, both by yourself as the work-based supervisor and also by the practice educator. And it's important that you discuss this as part of the opening discussions that take place between you and the practice educator. It's also important to remember that in terms of any supervision that you give the student, that actually it's not just about the carrying out of tasks, but it's in relation to the student performing as part of the learning opportunities made available to them. So depending on who you work for, you may have a very specific idea as to what constitutes supervision. However, before implementing that, you need to understand what is meant by supervision in terms of your own organization. And that may require you to take a few moments to stand back and think about supervision much more widely, but in particular with regards to a social work placement. So what is supervision? Well, according to Morrison, it's a process by which one worker is given responsibility by the organisation to work with another worker in order to meet the organisational, professional and personal objectives which together promote the best outcomes for service users. And I would say that Morrison's definition is a good place to start. However, what we need to remember is that you're going to be working with a student. And therefore, it's not just the organisational and professional objectives that have to be met. Also, it's about the student's objectives, which are to pass the placement. So let's just look at what supervision is a little bit more according to Kadyushin. So Kadyushin talks about there are 3 functions of supervision. There's the administrative or management function, and that's concerned with the promotion and maintenance of good standards of work and the adherence to organisational policies, and also to working with other key stakeholders, including not only the service user, but other professionals and also people that you work with as part of your organisation, so i.e. your colleagues, administrative staff. There's also the educational or development function, and this is concerned with the development of knowledge and skills and, importantly, attitude, particularly in terms of the social work role. In this function, the goals of supervision are seen to encourage reflection and exploration of the work, and also to develop new insights and perceptions on ways of working. This is hugely important as far as students are concerned. And you can do this immediately in the placement environment in a way that a long-arm practice educator cannot. And then finally, you've got the support function, and this involves you providing support that is both practical and psychological to the student. And Hughes and Pengelly argue that attending to the emotional response to the work that's being done is just as important as any other aspect of support that is given to a student. So there's been a suggestion that administrative, educative, and supportive functions of supervision can actually have tensions between them. And an example of that would be around surveillance and support. So surveillance could be, or the management function could be that you've given the student an instruction, but then you're monitoring them all the time. And what that means is that they feel under pressure to get something done in a way that you have clearly specified, but actually what you're missing is that support. And sometimes that support is about the student reaching out to you, or you checking in with the student to check that they're okay without watching what they're doing every minute of every moment that you've set them that task. Another example is enabling a student to develop their skills independently. So obviously that's about ensuring that they adhere to the policy and procedures of the organisation. And we need to remember that that has to be balanced alongside the culture of your organisation and the work that they're carrying out. And so even though a student might come to you and they may come with a great deal of experience, it doesn't mean that they're hugely experienced in terms of your organisation. So again, there'll be a need to educate them and support them accordingly. So let's return to this notion of the supervision culture within your organization. And what you see before you are a series of bullet points that Kettle identifies as almost the ideal. So that would begin with reviewing mistakes and problems as providing opportunities for learning as opposed to finding a scapegoat. Then there's the organizational commitment to continuous professional development for all staff. Also within that supervision culture as put forward by Kettle, that it's found to be one where there is professional autonomy and discretion is used, and where practice is not dominated by rule-bound proceduralism. Within the organization, there's an acknowledgement and a recognition of the emotional impact of the work, and that managers and senior managers develop systems not only through supervision but other processes that mitigate the worst effects of the emotional impact of the work. And then finally, the individuals and teams make time to review their effectiveness. Now, I don't know whether that's your organization, but it's certainly something to work towards, and certainly something that would benefit students. So when we're talking about benefits, how might a supervision culture of that which is outlined before you actually begin to benefit the student? Well, it can do so in the following ways. It can provide a safe space for the student to learn new skills and knowledge. It can provide a safe space to test out new ways of working, to reflect upon practice, and to think about their own values and ethics. But importantly, I think the key words here are safe space, where students feel that they can make mistakes, that they can learn without it being to their detriment. So those are the benefits of supervision, where you've got almost an ideal culture. But actually, how do you carry out supervision? In what ways is it carried out? Well, I'm going to suggest that there are at least 4 ways in which it can be done. So the first is formal. It's unplanned, and it may be delivered in response to a crisis. So the advantage here is that you, the work-based supervisor, is responding to the student's immediate needs. However, it's really important that you take time to ensure that any records are kept of that formal but unplanned supervision event, I would call it, and that any emerging needs are brought forward to the next planned supervision session, and importantly that you might share that information with the practice educator. Then following that, another way in which supervision can be provided is through the formal and planned and regular supervisory pattern. And this is, as you can well imagine, at the heart of the supervisory process. However, if it's the only means by which supervision takes place, then it's unlikely to provide the necessary emotional support and task assistance that is required by the student. And this will lead to support being delivered in a fashion that's not timely. And then following that, you've got the informal and unplanned, but often called the corridor supervision. So it's where, your student is walking past you and then they raise something that has happened to them maybe earlier in the day, or something's going to happen later in the week, and they're looking for maybe advice from you. And this has the characteristic of absolutely being responsive in that moment. However, there needs to be caution in ensuring that you, the work-based supervisor, you're not rushed into making immediate decisions or taking immediate action. You too need time to reflect and to critically think about what you're saying to the student. And again, one of the dangers with this approach is that it's not formally recorded. So you need to ensure that anything raised by the student in terms of the work that they're doing, the questions that they're asking, to what extent it fits with the PCF, you need to ensure that, a note of that encounter is written somewhere. And finally, you've got the informal, but it's planned. And this might be, arranging to have a telephone call with the student at the end of the working day, just to see how things are gone or have gone. Or you might want to actually arrange for a telephone call in the morning just to see how the student is doing and what they've got planned for the day, so you know where they are and what they are doing. You also need to remember that where you are the work-based supervisor, you may be part of a three-way supervision meeting. So that's between you and the practice educator and the student as well. And again, you would be strongly encouraged to speak to the practice educator before such a meeting. So what we have next are types of supervisor. And it's quite interesting because what it does is it points out that there is not a certain type or way of providing supervision. However, each type has its weaknesses and has its strengths as well. So let's begin with the authoritative approach, where if you're an authoritarian supervisor, you can clearly describe your students' strengths and weaknesses. You feel comfortable addressing performance concerns. However, what you will do, you'll have a tendency to do, is avoid discussing feelings and emotional responses to the work, which is can in the long run be quite detrimental to the student, and leaving the student feeling an increasing level of stress after supervision, and also a fear of being blamed if they admit anything has not gone well. If you're an authoritative supervisor, you'll feel comfortable discussing the student's feelings and emotional responses to the work. You'll be described by students as supportive, but you'll also be challenging them to think differently about their practice. You'll be able to clearly describe their strengths and their weaknesses, and you'll also be comfortable addressing performance concerns. If you're a permissive supervisor, then what will happen is you'll feel comfortable discussing the students' feelings and emotions. You'll be described by students as supportive, but actually you might find it hard to be specific about the skills and the capabilities of the student. And then what you've got is a neglectful supervision. And neglectful supervision is where, in actual fact, you have very little understanding of the student's strengths and weaknesses. You really don't feel comfortable in terms of addressing performance concerns and tend not to address performance concerns. You will barely discuss the students' feelings and emotional responses. And normally what students will say of such a supervisor is that they are not supportive at all. So understanding these models and understanding what they say about each type of supervision is hugely important. Now we're going to move on to an element of your work in terms of what you need to do as a work-based supervisor. And one of the things that you'll need to do as part of your overall supervision of the student on a daily basis is task assistance. So what you have is the PowerPoint slide, and then within the PowerPoint slide you have embedded a YouTube video using minions, and it's about task assistance. It's quite amusing. So what I'm going to do is give you a few moments to press on that, look at it, watch it, laugh hopefully, and then move on to the next slide. So hopefully you have had a chuckle with the minions in terms of changing a light bulb. But talking seriously now, task assistance is a hugely valuable component for students in terms of coming into the placement when they first start and undertaking tasks within the placement for the first time. And where task assessment is provided, what it does is it helps the student build confidence in terms of their future practice. It helps them to be brave in terms of undertaking complex tasks, and it also provides emotional support where needed. So in terms of task assistance, it allows for direct support. It's advice on courses of actions that might be taken, and also where approval is needed. So it's appreciating that your student will have a delegated task, but recognizing that for that student, there may be decisions that are beyond their role and they need to come back to you to have information around whether or not they can actually do something. So task assistance is hugely important in terms of taking all activity within the placement forward. There are a number of ways in which task assistance can be provided, and as you can see there, there may be ways that are hugely familiar to you as a work-based supervisor, primarily because you may have inducted a member of your team, a new member of team, via these means and mechanisms to help them understand the role that they are doing and the tasks that they have to do within that role. Task assistance has also been described within research in terms of it being seen as feedback, training, and coaching, and that it links to staff development. Again, building the skills, knowledge, and confidence of the individual to help them operate with far more autonomy. Now, one of the things that we really do need to look out for is actually your anxiety as a work-based supervisor, because it may be that you may feel that the time taken to explain to the student a particular task, it would be quicker for you to do it yourself. Now, there are real dangers associated with what anyone would call rescuing. So you're actually rescuing the student rather than enabling them and supporting them. So when you rescue and you take over and complete the task to its end, you're likely to militate against the development of the student over time. So what it calls for is incredible patience, even though I am fully aware that you have more than enough of a workload. So we've touched on task assistance. Let's take a few moments to look at the other important element of supervision, and that's emotional support. Hopefully, at the start of the placement, and also as part of the learning agreement, you'll have taken the time to get to know your student. However, The fact that every one of us across the globe has experienced COVID, and in particular in this country, the effects of lockdown, we need to be alert to the emotional implications of this for our students. So one of the things that you are encouraged to invest in is getting to know the student, getting to know what they did during lockdown, the effects of it upon their lives, in the sense of ensuring that support is given where needed for that student if they're still carrying the effects of lockdown with them. In terms of emotional support overall, there is evidence that suggests it's an important aspect of the supervisory process, helping to relieve anxiety. Most students, whether it's their first or second placement, will experience some level of anxiety as they understand, one, the importance of passing the placement, but then two, getting to grips with the organisation and the work that has to be carried out. In terms of emotional support for a student, this can actually best be achieved through a positive supervisory relationship. And what it does is it creates a safe space for students but there are also boundaries and confidentiality in place, and they are also explicit. So we go back to this notion of safe space. So let's give you an example. A student may be experiencing difficulties outside of the placement, maybe a family issue, and this is now beginning to impact on their performance in the placement. So what are you as work-based supervisor meant to be doing? Well, you're encouraged to discuss the issue with the student and then go on to encourage the student to discuss it with the practice educator and also the university personal tutor. And as a first step to resolving the impact of this external problem to the placement, the student is taking full responsibility for what actually happens next. Another aspect that we can look at in terms of emotional impact is around the performance of the student, and the fact that you may challenge the student on their lack of performance or their lack of getting things right. And this in and of itself may cause emotional stress. However, this can be mitigated against with the use of a supervision agreement, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more later. And what the supervision agreement does, it sets out the when, the how, the where. So it really puts all of that in place right at the beginning. So that if a student is challenged, it won't come as a surprise, that they will expect necessary challenge. I've already alluded to the fact that challenging practice is an important component in terms of supervision, and we'll be covering this much more as part of the troubleshooting presentation, which comes later in this series of presentations for work-based supervisors. As you can no doubt appreciate, there is an expectation that no student on placement will be able to get everything right, certainly not during their first few weeks. However, what if this continues for many weeks into the placement and beyond? Well, it's at this point that you'll need to challenge the practice of the student. And it's also important that when challenging the practice of the student as part of their case supervision, that you're very clear about what area of practice needs to be challenged. However, before doing so, it's really advisable that you discuss the areas with the practice educator so that there's a common understanding about the area of practice, and that this then begins to form the development of a series of solutions in conjunction with the student. However, before focusing on challenging the practice of the student, you may want to take time to think about the skills, the knowledge and the values that you have in terms of supervising a student, and particularly when challenging their practice. So let me give you a few moments to think. So, what did appear on your list? Was it self-awareness, recognizing your impact on others? Did you have down a positive expectations approach? So you're beginning from the point of thinking the student can potentially do this very well, and there's nothing to say otherwise. A really strengths-based approach, in other words. Did you come up with the fact that you need to have a knowledge of the student's individual circumstances and how that might affect their performance? Added to that, did you have an understanding of the student's individual support circumstances and how that might affect their ability to change? Because that is just as important. And finally, what about your listening skills and the ability to provide constructive feedback and motivate accordingly? So you can see that when it comes to challenging practice, you need to have the necessary skills and give it sufficient thought and time before doing so. We also need to remember that you may be challenging a student because of the biases and assumptions that the student holds. And they're exhibiting that in their work with service users. So it could come across as discriminatory and oppressive. It's never easy for any of us to hear that we might be working in a way that disadvantages individual service users or a service user group. The same is true for students, and therefore it's necessary to appreciate how uncomfortable this will be for the student, but it still needs to be worked through. So let's sum up everything that I've said with regards to this important element of supervision. So first and foremost, it's advisable that you discuss the areas that need to be challenged with the practice educator in the first instance so that you have a good understanding, both of you have a good understanding going forward. It's important that when speaking to the student that you are specific and you provide examples. It's also important that you ask the student about their perspective on what is happening, and that you ask the student how they feel their practice can improve. And then above all, it's really important that any and all suggestions going forward are put into an action plan, giving the student every opportunity to do well. I suppose what I would do is kind of point you to Dr. Brian Harris's comment. And I think this may be something that you might want to say right at the outset of the supervisory relationship that you have with the student, which is, in actual fact, that conflict is a natural and unavoidable part of life. And therefore, to think that you may not have a misunderstanding that may then lead to some form of conflict is possibly naive. So it's really important. Not only do you identify that there's conflict, but if there is, how is that conflict going to be resolved? So overall, when we're talking about effective supervision, particularly in your role as a work-based supervisor, we're talking about emotional and practical support to students, while at the same time keeping a firm eye on the standard of service being received by individuals. So we've taken the time to look at the concept of supervision, and then we've moved on to think about the ways in which supervision can be provided as an activity and also as a supervisor. We then took the time to look at elements of supervision, and now we're going to finish off with looking at tools of supervision, and this includes the supervision agreement and also how to record supervisory meetings, particularly for social work students. So let's just begin by thinking about the terms supervision contract or supervision agreement. You might use one or both of these terms in your workplace. But just to say that these can be used interchangeably, but the most important thing about them is They are a written document which sets out the content of the discussion that has taken place, and what it does is it establishes also how the work-based supervisor and the student will work together. And an agreement of this nature should be in your organization's policy, and if not, it's something that you can definitely introduce. So agreements of this kind are hugely important because they do a number of things. Well, firstly, provide an opportunity to establish the meaning of the term supervision within the organization, and also to prevent any misunderstandings. And we need to remember that for some students, this may be the first time they've been in a professional social care, social work setting. So this is entirely new to them. It also has the advantage of clarifying roles and responsibilities, and also the mandate for supervision. So what we're saying here is that case supervision and the critical supervision and reflective supervision that will come from the practice educator are different. But what they do holistically is bring a whole to the way in which the student practices. And it's really important that the student understand that any supervision meetings with the work-based supervisor are just as important as those with the practice educator. The other thing that a supervision agreement does is it establishes the collaborative nature of the supervision and the importance of the student taking an active part in the process. It also establishes the boundaries of the supervisory relationship so that there are clear understandings around confidentiality and communication pathways with others that have some responsibility for a student's work. For example, if the student went out with a colleague and then was overly familiar with a service user, the student would be aware that it would be perfectly reasonable for your colleague to come back to you and report to you about that. A supervision agreement also provides space for you and the student to understand the experience that you each bring to the process and how that can be used positively to work together. It also makes clear and promotes anti-oppressive practice through exploration of the factors that might impact on the supervisory relationship with the student. So if you are a work-based supervisor and you have 15 years of experience, that might be totally intimidating to a 19-year-old student who has maybe done some volunteering but really doesn't know very much about social work. So it's really important that we're mindful of our own characteristics in terms of our knowledge, our skills, and also our ethnicity, and also our gender as well. Supervision agreements are really important in terms of establishing the emotional impact. We've already touched on that before, and it also provides a forum for establishing from the start the fact that good supervision also includes challenging the student, and also regularly communicating to the student not only their progress, but also their ability to meet the PCFs. And it also establishes how the relationship will be reviewed. So what I mean by that is you may be 4 to 8 weeks into the placement, and then at that point you take the time to review what's happening. So in terms of the supervision agreement that exists between you and the student, it should be similar to the one used within your organization, but there will be a number of differences. And that's about appreciating the student is in placement. So it may have things about practical arrangements for formal one-to-one supervision. There will be no doubt a link between the supervision that you provide and that received by the practice educator. Then there'll be the content of the supervision. Again, this is something that you would need to speak to the practice educator beforehand so that the student receives supervision that's complementary rather than at odds with each other. It'll set out the expectations that you have of the
student. So, is there an expectation that they are to complete the supervision notes, you read them and you sign them off, or do you do them? Is there an expectation that the student is to come to you with an agenda, or that you have set agenda items and then the student comes to you with any others that they want to discuss? It will also set out what the student needs to do in terms of preparation. It certainly should be covering things like how difficulties will be resolved, and the methods that will be used for resolving those difficulties. It should also include how the supervision will be recorded and whose responsibility it is, and if there are any disagreements in terms of how the supervision has been recorded, how those will be dealt with. An important component of any supervision agreement is appreciating the gender, culture, age, ethnicity, previous work experience of the student. So what we need to do is remember to build in regular reviews, ensuring that in no way any aspect of that student in terms of their life experiences and their protected characteristics are taken for granted. And again, this is something that you might want to discuss with the practice educator. You also need to be aware of the fact that as part of the student placement portfolio, certainly for NTU students, there's a record of supervision which is signed off by the practice educator. You may wish to create your own record. Additionally, there's also the placement attendance sheet which has to be signed off by you. So copies of these are available in the section on supervision, and you can also receive them from the student. As said earlier, the supervision record also belongs to the student, and therefore it's really good practice that both you and the student should have a copy of the supervision notes and have a system for agreeing that it reflects the interaction that actually took place. And that might be simply a matter of signing it and dating it. Good practice also suggests that there are personal components in a supervisory relationship that should not be part of the professional supervision process. And what you may need to do is you may need to create a separate confidential record that indicates that a particular discussion has taken place, and that there may be difficulties outside of the placement that are impacting on the student's performance. And again, this is something that you are encouraged to speak to the student about, and particularly encouraging the student to speak directly to the practice educator and directly to their personal tutor, not taking on the responsibility yourself. So in terms of recording the supervision, here are 4 suggestions. First of all, to write up the notes and actions agreed. Who does that is something that you'll need to agree on. You need to confirm the accuracy with the student. It might be that the student does the notes, but you go on to confirm them, but the student also has to confirm them if there's equity. To ensure that you and the student have signed and dated copies of the notes, and this can be easily lost in the hurly-burly of a student placement. So it's important that you keep signed and dated copies, and if the student hasn't signed, then you need to chase the student. And then finally, to agree a time and date and location for the next supervision if you've not already done so. And again, this can go by the wayside, particularly if you as a work-based supervisor is rushing from one meeting to the next. So overall, we've had an opportunity to look at the concept of supervision and all of the areas that sit within that concept. I hope that you have found this presentation helpful. And if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to go back to the university or to speak to your practice educator for further advice and support. Here's hoping that the recording has been of use to you. And as said, if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to speak to your practice educator or come back to the university for further clarification. Thank you very much.